10 years ago, Donna did a IA Summit talk on this book, which was George Lakoff's Women, Fire and Dangerous Things, and I still think it stands as a bit of an IA classic, and today I just actually wanted to revisit it in less time and covering less ground, but I thought it'd be a fun thing to look at, so I think we just had something macro, this is exactly micro, so sort of bear with me. George Lakoff was obsessed with how we use categories, how we work with categories, and his main shtick was this sort of classical view of categorization and challenging it. So the classical view of categorization is that essentially membership of a category is by a shared set of properties. That means that they've got nice clean boundaries because you're either a member or you're not. It's objective, it doesn't matter about the person doing the categorization, because if you can work out does it have the property or not, you do the checklist and you can decide whether it's a member or not. And he sort of dedicated this sort of sizable book to sort of challenging that notion. I think it's got some really interesting implications for how we do IA. Now, the sort of father of classical categorization was Aristotle, and he sort of developed this sort of 20 questions game, which was, if you ask the right set of questions, regardless of who you are, you can essentially be able to categorize things in exactly the same way. It's basically a reasoned activity. And one of the first challenges to this is this idea that not every member of a category is equal. We have best examples. So prototype theory is all about this idea that in any category we have best examples. So we're going to do a quick experiment now, which is taking birds. If you want to sort of just think about a member of the category birds. So just a sort of quick show of hands. When you sort of thought about bird, who sort of had a small sort of garden bird in their head? Okay, so sort of 40%, and how many pigeons? A sort of London bias towards pigeons. Okay, any ostriches? Wow. Okay, yeah, 3 ostriches. Penguins? Wow. Okay, cool. Okay, so it definitely worked in terms of there was more garden birds and pigeons and ostriches and penguins. But as you can see, people gravitate towards best examples, but actually your best example is a very personal thing. And I think what was really interesting about your talk was some of that, and lots of the thinking actually comes from anthropology, because it wasn't until we looked at how other people categorize things that we actually realized the classical model didn't hold for ourselves. So I think some of those rituals you're talking about are actually implanting these best examples on people at an early age, so that it can help them work and sort of categorize things in a culturally sort of meaningful way. And that was really interesting. Okay. So we've got these best examples. So not all members of a category are equal. We have sort of better examples that we can draw upon, as you just did a minute ago. The next stage is that actually membership of a category isn't necessarily by a shared set of properties. And Wittgenstein was the first one to sort of pick up on this and challenge it in his example of games. There's no one set of property that all games share. And actually the group of games is a network of similarities between the different examples. So for instance, football is a competitive sport between 2 teams, which is shared by golf in terms of it's got a competitive element, it's played with a ball. Chess is a bit like that because it's competitive, there's no ball involved, just sort of sitting inside, it's not an outdoor sport. And then something like Patience is played with cards where you play against yourself, it's not competitive, but actually through this sort of active imagination and examples, we can hold a category together basically through these similarities of these different examples. So challenging the classical model, which essentially said, to actually categorize something, you just know that if it's got this property and that property, it's in, if it's not, it's out. So that isn't actually how we think about things. And I think actually Wittgenstein also talks about how us working categories like that gives us an advantage actually, because it gives us the flexibility to be able to categorize things on the fly. So when video games came along, how do we incorporate video games in our notion of the category of games and things like that? So when we put these two things together, we actually get a lot better sense of how we actually work with categories on a daily basis. And when I talk about categories, I'm not talking necessarily just in the librarian sense. It's actually, when I'm asked to give a talk, what does a talk mean to me? And I sort of think, okay, probably means PowerPoint slides. Unfortunately, that's the sort of the example I have of the talk, and so I know what I'm letting myself in for. And actually, we work with categories in our language on a sort of minutely basis. So So we've got our best examples and we've got family resemblance. How we actually do, as a rule, work with categorisation is if I'm asked to say what type of thing is a sedan chair, I have my mental image of a sedan chair, and then I start comparing it to best examples in categories. So, for instance, I might be thinking, okay, I've got my best example of a chair, and I'm doing some sort of imaginative, creative hops, similarities to how close is a sedan chair to the chair. I can sort of get there, and then equally I can sort of think about actually how close is it to sort of my idea of sort of a form of transport, and I start thinking about relationships between the bikes. So on a daily basis, when we're reacting to categories and navigation, we're often doing this little dance of sort of thinking about the best example and then doing these sort of imaginative comparisons. So that's why actually the way we intuitively work with categories is a lot more like family fortunes than 20 questions. So I don't know how familiar people are with sort of the notion of family fortunes, that a contestant is given a category and says, give me an example of that category that we think 100 people who've been polled will most likely have come up with. So I'm guessing this one is something like things you might take into the bath, and most people said soap and then sponge and book and floating toy or whatever. So you can see that actually family fortunes relies on this principle of sort of best example and family resemblance to actually be able to think of examples. And of course, when you put someone in a sort of stressful position like a game show, you get amusing answers, and one of the reasons the format works. So we get little gems like this that a way of name a way of toasting someone, and someone's just gone over a fire. They've got their categories a little bit wrong there. My personal favourite that I spent the last 3 days trying to work out what on earth is the connection here. Something that comes in pairs of rabbits. So the only theories I come up with is either someone's thinking it's sort of cruel to have a rabbit on its own, so it's always best to have rabbits in pairs, or there's a long history of jug geese. They're the only two theories I've got at the moment for sort of where that's come from. And then obviously the classic, which is now I'm couple. And all the others sort of move into sort of sort of xenophobia and stereotypes. So I haven't put those up. But interestingly enough, a lot of where bias and stereotype comes from exactly the same effect, that actually for given categories we have prototypical examples, and actually it's a culturally shared version of that where lots of those things come from. So I was just going to give some practical examples of why you should care about this. And the first one I was going to start with was recycling, which is sort of the sort of categorising bane of my life, and I don't know, lots of things, which is, you're somewhere and you have a coffee cup, possibly one of those things that goes around it, I don't know what they're called, and you've got to work out how you're going to recycle these 3 bits of things. So originally, sort of a long time ago when we started recycling, the industry assumed that recycling was a complicated problem. If you gave people the right tools, they would work out how to recycle something. They already had an existing classification, a scientific classification for different materials, and if you provided people with that tool, they would be able to recycle things. I think the thing here is that it's not necessarily saying classical categories or sort of scientific categorization is wrong. It's just not intuitively how we work with categorization, and we have to start thinking about categories and taxonomies as tools that we give people, and like any tool that you give someone, they need to learn how to use it, they need to know what it's used for and gain experience for using it. So actually using this in a professional capacity with training and experience, it's a very, very useful tool for doing your job if you work in the recycling industry. If you're using it as an individual who is in town trying to recycle a coffee cup, it's almost impossible, yeah? And actually what happens is you fall back on a sort of a non-classical categorization default mode, which is essentially, I know you recycle a newspaper, how close is this cup to a newspaper? You do the family resemblance thing and you go, well, it's got that waxy inside, do I, don't I? Plastic top, I have my prototypical example of a plastic recycled thing, and I do my little comparison to how close it is to that. And actually, the result is you get terrible, people are just chucking all sorts of shit into recycling. So the interesting thing is, recently you've actually seen a change, because actually now recycling councils are actually reflecting more of how we instinctively work with categories, and think, actually, instead of giving this classification scheme, what we're going to do is give as many best example as we can, and then people have a better chance of actually doing the family resemblance between the thing of recycling and some good examples. And even better, let's give some bad examples as well, so we can sort of say, okay, it's sort of sitting closer to there than there. So I think that's just one sort of tangible example of how this applies to how, how we sort of deal with things in day-to-day life. Okay, and the next one is from, BBC program categories. So I think this can be a little exercise, work out and actually sort of hopefully experience how you're reacting to categories and actually sort of try and sort of see how naturally this occurs when we're working with sort of things like categorization of programs. So our job today is think about which genre does Top Gear live in. And the first one I'm going to give you is this one, factual. So factual is a horrible category to give you. Is Top Gear part of factual or not? So the first thing you're probably doing is actually thinking, what best examples can I think of factual? And one of the reasons factual is an absolute dog of a category, don't know about you, but I really struggle to get any best examples. So you're already at a disadvantage. If it's documentaries, you'd be going, yeah, easy, that's David Attenborough in The Galapagos. Factual's like, maybe a documentary, not entirely sure. So first of all, it's a dog of a category because we can't readily bring those best examples up. Maybe someone who's worked with categories a lot probably would do better. Or we think not necessarily. But, so the next thing I can do as an information architect is I can actually provide people with some examples, and immediately this changes the category because you've actually got a sense the gravity shifted a little bit from your own offered examples to some that we're offering you as. And these two I've offered you here probably aren't helping that much. Is Top Gear a factual genre or not? These are real ones from what factual actually does have in it. Dog Borstal and Antiques Roadshow. So probably what we're doing now is actually looking at the family resemblance of how close is Top Gear to Dog Borstal, which is kind of an imaginative stretch, basically. It's on a family fortunes level. I think that this is probably the most interesting one for me, which is actually we sort of assume that a category doesn't change when presented alongside, well, maybe I assume it doesn't change, but actually what happens when you provide two categories alongside each other, how we think about them significantly changes. So what's happening here is like, is Top Gear more of an entertainment genre or factual? It can live in both, but what we're doing there is actually now entertainment is actually changing how we think about factual. It's got a little bit of a gravitational pull on it, and our best examples are starting to shift, and there's something happening as we present categories next to each other, which I think is a really interesting sort of thing for information architects, that not only the categories and the labels you choose, but actually how you put those categories next to each other actually fundamentally affects how we work with those categories. And then finally, I'm going to give you the next level down, and as soon as we see the sort of child of factual, it's dead easy. And one of the reasons that's easy, and I'm not talking about it today, is that would be an example Lakoff would call a basic level category. There's this sort of level of categories where it's just very instinctive and easy to work with. They tend to be the level where we can still have a single visual image of it, and when we get above that, things get a bit murky. So with factual, you don't have a sort of image of what factual is, but with cars and motoring, you do more. So that was just some examples of how working with this can affect the user experience of how we present categories to people. And I think, in that sense, Netflix is fascinating, because if you think about the examples are changing on a minutely basis, potentially. So actually, our perception of the category changes as our examples were provided. Actually, they might change person to person. The categories that they present next to each other will change probably on a person-to-person basis based on what you're watching. And I think, without drawing any profound conclusions, I think the one basic conclusion is it's actually really difficult to test a categorization scheme or navigation without actually using real data in the real context. So it's prototyping, and it's not just prototyping without data in it, but unless you're pumping it full of real examples of the data that's in there, you're not really knowing how your users are going to react to it. So, not particularly profound conclusion, but I think it's an interesting one. Okay, so that's me, and I was just going to do some sort of further reading. Obviously, Donna's paper is still available on the internet, and it's really worth a read, because she goes a lot more into the basic level categories, and she's got a good sort of list of references there, so I think it's really worth a read. you can try reading that. I don't, some of it's quite good. I'd stop after a certain point, but it's good. But some of Lakoff's later work's really, really interesting. He sort of goes off on one a bit where he starts getting more into metaphor. And then his most recent thing is actually when we start to sort of fundamentally understand how categories and frames of reference affect how we debate things, he starts talking about politics a lot. So he's interested in how actually in the US, the Republicans have phrased the metaphor and conversation in politics, and the Democrats traditionally have just been reacting to a frame they've set, and actually sort of says that they shouldn't be. Anyway, it's really interesting reading. There's something called Don't Think of an Elephant, which is a guideline for Democrats and how to sort of change it, and it was very influential in Obama's election. So anyway, I wasn't going to talk about that, but there's some really interesting stuff he's gone on to do, quite nutty. But, and the only other one I recommend is anyone who hasn't read it before, there's some really good stuff on sort of practical, sort of, basic level category stuff in Mike's presentation, which again is another IO classic. So yeah. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. If anyone's got one, we'll run up the mic to you. Anyone? Oh, we go.
Do you think there's a limit to the amount of categories people can understand at one time?
As presented in one, I think it depends on the context, because I remember sort of there's the old, the 7 and 3 rule, which is often cited, and then sort of someone pointed out that sort of, actually if you're being asked to select a country or where you're from, then the list can be sort of exhaustive and it doesn't really matter. So I think it's contextual. But I mean, Lakoff will sort of say that actually on a day-to-day basis, every sentence, every sort of, in our day-to-day thinking is informed by categories, but I know that's not really the question. Sorry.
Any more questions? Yeah.
I mean, we talk about category. What is your thinking around something like tagging, in a way a bit more flat rather than tree-like structure?
I think so. I think with tagging, that there's what you're trying to achieve in terms of end user, and I think all the stuff we just seen there applies. Netflix is a tagging. Actually, it's more tagging than it is categorization. But I think one of the big implications is actually the taggers and the ability to apply quality tags is as important as the sort of end user, implications. So I think it's thinking more about everyone in the chain and how they're working with categories and understanding them and interpreting them.
Is other or miscellaneous unavoidable every time you make a categorization?
So Lakoff addresses it directly and actually says it's inevitable, and it's not necessarily bad. Yeah. So I mean, the whole title, which is specifically around anthropological studies in Aboriginal tribes, where myth will form there'll be prototypical examples: sun, which is mythologically connected to women, and then there's the sun's associated with poisonous things because of the feeling of sunburn. So there's a whole category around the sun, and then men and the moon, and all the associations there. And then there's just an other category where you just chuck everything else that you can't categorize. Yeah, to a certain extent, he says it's inevitable.
Hello, hi. The main problem I have with categories is that they are intrinsically fairly static and more often than not come with a great deal of redundancy. Whereas technology is pushing us and our users more and more towards a fairly fluid definition of core categories and taxonomies are. You mentioned Netflix, but there are systems like MovieLens, for example, to stay in the same domain, which allows users to actually define their own classifications, and you've got systems that are able to reason in a fairly fluid categorization and have your product and your UX to react to effectively uncanned taxonomies. So how do you see these tensions between the classic idea of a taxonomy, which is something, if you like, is pre-canned and fixed, towards effectively the digital world pushing us more and more towards a more dynamic and effectively unknown way of classifying things?
Mm-hmm. Right, so Fabio, I think the interesting distinction is that one between how we instinctively work with categories versus the tools we inevitably have to build for people to use. And I think actually what we're doing a lot of time when talking about sort of building categories for use is we inevitably have to put sets of categories together to use. And I think the only thing we're saying here is actually there's a load of implications for this phenomenon that we need to think about. And I think it's all those examples again, which is you know, showing best examples and sort of testing the comparison. But I mean, folksonomic tag, I'm not sure. Different types of tools, I guess. But.
One more. Final question.
Just curious, at the BBC, did the information architects and the program creators ever have disagreements about how a program is categorized? And how do you resolve those if they program creator might feel like it's categorized as a factual program, whereas you guys think that the research points to it being an entertainment program?
What, do you want to, any thoughts on moving on? I don't know. I'd imagine almost inevitably, but talk to either Paul or Michael about that, and I'm sure you'll get some really good stories.
Thanks very much, Silva.